Hello, AP Psychology students, and welcome to Unit 2 of our course. I absolutely love this unit. The brain is the most mysterious and fantastic organ in the entire universe. It is amazing, and it is made up of billions of neurons and cells. And so in this unit, we're going to talk about the brain, its structures, the chemicals that it makes, how our nervous system puts it all together, how we know how to respond, how we direct our muscles to move, etc. It is really, really an interesting unit, and I hope that you get a lot from it. Okay, so the first thing that you need to do is go to Schoology and download the chart packet that has the neuron, the brain, some other things in it. It's actually about 8 pages long. If you are able to print that off at home, that would be great. I think that you would appreciate being able to write onto the charts themselves. If you're going to be in class on Thursday, I'll actually hand out the packet to you in person. So for hybrid students, I have copies of the packet at school. Okay, so let's start labeling the neuron. Let's just think about what an amazing cell the neuron is. It is an electrical cell, and it is a chemical cell. There are parts of it that transmit electrical energy and parts of it that produce chemicals and transmit chemical messages. It is truly an amazing cell. Another cell in the nervous system is called a glial cell. And glial cells are like the glue, that's kind of what it sounds like, that supports the nervous system. And it's the place that takes up the space between our neurons in the brain and in the nervous system. Now, it used to be thought that glial cells really didn't have much of a function in the brain or the nervous system, but now people believe that glial cells are actually quite important for the functioning of our nervous system. And in fact, a particularly aggressive sort of brain cancer called a glioblastoma is a genetic mutation of the glial cells. So we know that they have an important function. We don't know what all the functions are yet of the glial cells, although it is being investigated. Now, as I go through this, I'm going to speak fairly quickly, but I'd like you to pause as needed to write down what each of these parts of the neurons are. And maybe you can remember some of them from biology. First of all, these are the dendrites. These are the branch-like fibers that come out from the cell body, and they actually receive chemical messages from the neighboring cell. The nucleus, letter G on your diagram, contains the cell DNA, so it instructs the cell on what it should do. Letter F is the cell body. This is the chemical machinery of the cell, and so it actually takes that chemical message that's being transmitted into the dendrites, and then it gives instructions to the rest of the neuron about what to do, whether to initiate an action potential and send a message down the electrical part of the cell, which is called the axon. The axon, if you think of a wire that is not covered, and you were to touch that. So like in class, I ask people, has anyone been electrocuted? And some people have, because they've touched a frayed wire, or they've put, their finger with a metal piece in a socket or something like that. And it's a very strong feeling. It's very shocking. You get a shock, okay? And that's because you're interrupting the flow of where that electricity would normally go, just like touching an electrical fence at a farm, you'd be interrupting the flow from that electrical fence into your arm. So B does carry the electrical impulse. Now, it is shielded or protected by something called the myelin sheath. Now, we have this fat and protein insulation, and it allows for a smooth transmission very rapidly across the length of the neuron. Now, this is a really important structure because if this starts to harden, you could get a disease called multiple sclerosis. That is something that you should know. And multiple sclerosis means that this starts to harden. And so that message you might be getting from your motor cortex to your leg is not going to go smoothly because little bits of the electrical impulse are shooting out elsewhere and they're not going through quickly like they normally would. Now keep in mind, this neuron can be anywhere from microscopic to 3 feet long, depending on what it is. The terminal buttons are where the neurotransmitters are produced and released, and then they're released across here, the synaptic cleft, back into the dendrites of the neighboring neuron, which are illustrated here with the letter A. So that's the basic structure of the neuron. Now I would write this next part just right in this area down here. There are 3 types of neurons. So right now, if you are holding your pencil, there are some neurons right under your skin, some receptors that can feel the sensation of touch and of pressure. And that information is carried by afferent neurons up to the part of your central nervous system that can understand what it is. So I am holding onto this whiteboard marker and I can feel the soft plastic up in this part of my brain in a place called the parietal lobe, and we'll learn more about that later. Now let's say I decide to move my hand, okay? So I'm moving my hand and there's a part right behind that, right in front of the place where you could feel the sensation of the brain, of the pen, to where you could actually initiate the movement of the pen. These are called efferent neurons. So they go from your brain or the spinal cord for some of them to regulate the action of a muscle or a gland. So any of your muscles, voluntary or involuntary, need motor neurons in order to move. And then finally we have interneurons. It's interneurons that makes up this thing we call the brain. You know, it's just a really cool, amazing thing. And interneurons just connect with other neurons and they send messages very, very rapidly, up to 200 times per second. Okay, now we're going to look at the process of chemical transmission. So, first of all, you should label these parts. Turn the page of your diagram and you'll see one that looks just like this. So what we're zeroing in on is the area between the terminal button and the dendrite. Again, if you need to pause or listen, please do that. So let's label this. This is the terminal button. This whole area here is the terminal button. There is a membrane at the end of the terminal button called the presynaptic membrane. There is these vesicles, and they contain the neurotransmitters that tell the neuron what to do. So if you wiggle your hand right now, there are 2 neurotransmitters that are helping you to do that, acetylcholine and dopamine. We'll talk more about those later on. And they're released from a synaptic vesicle. This right here is called a reuptake channel, and I'll explain in a little bit why that's so important. Down here, these things that look like blocks, they're actually just chemical structures, but they're illustrated by this kind of design. These are called receptor molecules. So in my hand, where I have these motor neurons and these sensory neurons, these receptor molecules will take in specific neurotransmitters like a lock and key. And then the postsynaptic membrane is this whole membrane that contains the receptor molecules. The space in between is called the synapse. Okay, so what happens when, first of all, we'll talk about the electrical message later on. So we're just talking about the chemical message. So from up here, an electrical message has come down and it said, hey, you know what, terminal button? It's time for you to do your work. So what does it do? Well, it does number 1 here. It pushes the synaptic vesicle towards the presynaptic membrane, and it fuses with the presynaptic membrane. Number 2, this is right here. The synaptic membrane, or vesicle rather, will open up and it will release neurotransmitters into the synapse, or what we also call the synaptic cleft. So as I'm talking about acetylcholine and dopamine, that's what is helping me move my lips right now, okay? So there's dopamine and acetylcholine hopping through the neurons of my mouth and is directing the action of my mouth, okay? these neurotransmitters are. And they're all part of a big process. Obviously, they couldn't do it alone. They couldn't do it without my brain, for example. I couldn't talk without my brain. It's kind of important. Okay. Number 3, right here. The neurotransmitters find a lock. So whether it's my acetylcholine or my dopamine, this molecule is going to welcome that neurotransmitter. It's going to lock in with that, and it's going to take that message into the postsynaptic membrane or the dendrite of the receiving neuron. Number 4, we have excess neurotransmitters. So the neurotransmitter is released, and then we have excess. So what happens to it? Well, 2 things. It can either be absorbed by enzymes in the synaptic cleft. And I know this part is obscured, but just listen to what I have to say here. It can be drawn back up the reuptake channel, so it goes back up and it forms a new synaptic vesicle. Now this process goes extremely rapidly. Now I'd like to ask you a question. I don't expect you to answer it, but if you take a medication, especially something like an antidepressant, what it does is it actually chemically blocks the reuptake channel. So you can look on the instructional package for the medication that you take, and if it says it's a reuptake inhibitor, so all kinds of drugs are reuptake inhibitors: Paxil, Prozac, Wellbutrin, Zoloft. Okay, there's a whole group of them. They're called SSRIs. They're called selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. And what they do is they chemically block this channel here, and that allows more of the neurotransmitter to stay in your system. So for something like depression, if you take an SSRI like Zoloft, it's going to keep more serotonin available to you to help you to overcome your depression if it's due to lack of serotonin. So I'm going to show you a short video here that will illustrate this process.
Communication between 2 neurons begins when an electrical impulse called an action potential travels along the axon of a presynaptic neuron toward the axon terminal. The action potential cannot cross the synaptic space. When it reaches the axon terminal, it causes membranous sacs called vesicles to move toward the membrane of the axon terminal. The membrane of the vesicle fuses with the membrane of the axon terminal, enabling the vesicle to release its contents into the synaptic space. The molecules released from the vesicles are chemicals called neurotransmitters. They drift across the synaptic space and bind to special proteins called receptors on the postsynaptic neuron. The binding of a neurotransmitter to its receptor can trigger an action potential in the postsynaptic neuron. That electrical signal then moves toward the cell body of the postsynaptic neuron. Now that the neurotransmitter has relayed its message, it releases from the receptor into the synaptic space. Some of the neurotransmitter is degraded by enzymes in the synaptic space, and some of the neurotransmitter is carried back into the presynaptic neuron through transporter proteins. The neurotransmitter that is taken back up into the presynaptic neuron is then repackaged into vesicles that can be released the next time an action potential reaches the axon terminal. The entire process repeats each time an action potential reaches the axon terminal of the presynaptic neuron.
Your idea?
So that is how the synapse works. I'm going to end today's lesson today. That's a lot to take in. And we will continue to discuss the process of neural transmission the next time. So I hope you've enjoyed this edition of Introduction to the Neuron and the Synapse. Trust me, there's more really cool stuff to come. All right. Thanks. Bye.